All right, well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Prairie Conservation Action Plan's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Kayla Balderson-Burak, and I'm the manager here at the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan. Every month, PCAP asks someone to present either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk at a particular venue on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. Most previous speaker series presentations are archived under playlists on the PCAP YouTube channel, and I'll show you the link to our social media sites after the presentation. So this presentation will be linked onto our YouTube page as well as our PCAP home web page as well. So keep an eye open for that and feel free to pass the link around to anyone who might be interested and couldn't make it today. At the end of the presentation, I'll show you these websites as well as the website for our Prairie Conservation and Endangered Species Conference coming up in February in Saskatoon. So there are about 65 people registered for this webinar, so that's great. Thank you very much for everyone for coming out. Keep your eye out for our next webinar, which will take place on Monday, January 18th, and this will be given by Heather Fassett from Parks Canada, Grasslands National Park, about their efforts to reduce fence-related wildlife collisions. So if you have any questions during the presentation, on the left side of your webinar menu there, you'll notice there's a pop-up box there where you can type in questions, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll moderate any questions that come up. I would like to take a moment to note that in-kind support for this project has been given by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and that this project was undertaken with the financial support of the Government of Canada and the Federal Department of the Environment. Now a bit about Kerry. Kerry LaForge has worked with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for over 13 years, focusing on rangeland and forage management. Most of her career has been focused on landscape ecology and grazing management systems. She has assessed over 168,000 hectares of land using provincial health assessment protocols and range condition assessments. The land assessed includes mixed grass prairie, sand dunes, aspen parkland, boreal forest, and riparian ecosystems. She has worked on developing management plans representing over 90,000 hectares of AAFC community pastures. These plans include such things as proposed livestock grazing rotations, invasive weed management strategies, water developments, brush management, and soil stabilization. She has also worked in the mitigation of impacts caused by resource extraction, such as oil and gas activity. Kerry's current work moves across the research, development, and tech transfer continuum and focuses on the use of winter annuals in polycultures for grazing. So with that, I'm going to give control over to Kerry here, and she can start the presentation.
All right, well, great. I hope everybody can hear me fine. As Kayla said, my name is Kerry LaForge. I work with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and it's great to hear that there are 65 attendees. If it goes across Canada, I've got kind of a tough spot to give a presentation. I've either got the ones that are waiting for lunch and are hungry, the ones that have are eating lunch, or the ones that have had lunch and are ready for a nap. So hopefully I can keep it exciting enough for you. I have never done a webinar before, so bear with me if I stumble a little bit, though I did do my hair and makeup for this occasion. So let's get started. So the Grazing Response Index is what I'd like to talk to you about today. And that sort of focuses on rangeland monitoring. It is a rangeland monitoring tool. So rangeland definitions, because this presentation is going across Canada. Rangelands, in some cases, have varying definitions depending on which part of the country you're from. For example, in Ontario, I've heard the statement that we don't have rangelands. But for this purposes, it's land supporting Indigenous or native species and introduced vegetation that is grazed and can be managed as a natural ecosystem. So functions of rangelands. Productivity, that primary production that we use for grazing and wildlife habitat. Soil and site stability. They capture water and and hold the soil in place. Nutrient cycling, the movement of those nutrients from deep within the soil up to the surface, and again with the grazing, which then puts the nutrients back in, or most of the nutrients back into the system, or the litter that's left behind, it just recycles the nutrients. And plant species diversity. Rangelands are more polycultures. The tame, I understand, is more of a monoculture in a lot of cases, that we're hopefully moving to more of a polyculture. But there's a lot of species diversities in these rangelands, and not just limited to plants, but there's wildlife, there's bacteria, there's funguses in the soil, vesicular, arbuscular mycorrhiza, all those things that work in unison in rangelands. And what do we gain from having healthy rangelands? Well, what we do gain is we gain sustainable grazing for wildlife and livestock. We have that continual sort of stable productivity over time, water conservation, and efficiency and flexibility. Within a healthy rangeland system, efficiency and flexibility within our grazing management is key. If we have those healthy, functioning, productive rangelands, we can move our times of grazing. We can maybe allow for grazing over longer drought periods. So when we have a drought, our carrying capacities remain more stable. And again, that all relates down to economic stability. If we're always following the weather cycles, increasing our herd when it's wet and having to sell when it's dry, you know, you're going to have one year where you're going to, you know, get a little more income, but as soon as it gets dry and you have no remaining forage, you're going to have to sell some of your animals. So you're going to follow that fluctuation, which doesn't provide you the stability. And healthy rangelands, you look at the one on the left that says short recovery period. You look at that rangeland and you see that there's production, there's structure, the vegetation, there's various structures, there's forbs, there's shrubs, there's litter covering the soil. All of the nutrient cycling is going on in that landscape. The water retention is going on in that landscape. And if you look at the rangeland on the right-hand side, the long recovery period, you see that the vegetation is very short. It doesn't have its vigor. There's a lot of bare soil, and what does bare soil do for you? It increases your soil temperature, reduces your water holding capacities, and increases evaporation. So if you look at those two examples, you probably want to manage for a bit more on, or manage for the short recovery period or the healthy functioning rangelands. And why should you monitor your rangelands? Monitoring is a tool to help manage your rangelands. You need to know, first of all, what is your starting point? What do I have? If you don't know what you have, it's hard to get to your end point, is what should I have? You can determine trends. How over time are your rangelands functioning? What is the health and function of my rangelands? I can determine what my management impacts are having on the landscape. That way I know that, you know what, oops, maybe I'm stocking too high. Maybe I'm not stocking enough. You know, that is where your monitoring will come in. And it will, again, determine management changes to be made on the landscape. How can I improve my management? Do I need to develop watering systems to help with distribution? Can I use salt? Can I use mineral? Is fencing the best option? Those sorts of things, if you monitor your rangelands, you can start answering some of those questions. So basically, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So that gets us to the Grazing Response Index. The Grazing Response Index is fairly new into Canada. It's sort of a buzzword. There's been a little bit of research, which we will get into that. I don't think it's an adapted management tool at this time, or adopted management tool, I should say. The Grazing Response Index is a very short-term monitoring tool and allows a comprehensive evaluation of the current year's grazing impacts on the plants. And the most important is the current years. It does not assess your historical grazing impacts. It's just, what have I done this year and how has that affected my plants? And it's used to make management decisions for the following year. So the GRI Pros, it's based on science, though I'm not going to really get into a whole lot of the science today, but it is based on scientific principles. It's simple. It can be completed by a producer or a manager, and that is the main goal, is to get this into producers' hands or land managers' hands to be able to make the decisions on their landscape. It is effective. It does assess what you have done on your plants so you can mitigate or change your management strategies for the next year. The data is readily available. You don't have to wait for it to be analyzed. It doesn't have to go out to a consultant. The data is right there. So again, this in turn allows producers or managers to make decisions in a timely manner. Cons, simple. And I put that with a question mark for those of you out there that have worked with the GRI. Depending on your outcomes or your goals or your familiarity with the landscape, sometimes it's not as simple as you think it is. I have been in field workshops where we will walk into the same field and we will all get a different result. Not saying each result is wrong, it's just saying that depending on what you want to manage for, your GRI can have slightly different answers. So if you're managing for a plant species, for example, or a species at risk such as sage grouse, those that are just managing for grazing, for sort of that even utilization, may get different results. So keep that in mind. It was developed for native rangelands in the United States. There has been some research, again, which I will get into a little bit later, on native rangelands in Canada. And what we've so far found out, I'll just give you a bit of a heads up, is that it does apply in Canada to some of our native species. And does it apply to tame forages? That's the big question. Do tame forages respond the same as native forages? And there is some work going on in Saskatchewan, a little bit of a demonstration to figure this out. But it does not measure long-term changes on the landscape. It doesn't look at plant species composition, it doesn't look at structure, and it doesn't look at physical aspects such as soil erosion or litter, or things that you may find more familiar with the range health assessment. So the GRI is scored on 3 factors affecting plant health. First one is the frequency of grazing, intensity of grazing, and opportunity for plant recovery. Frequency. So this area is scored on the number of times plants are defoliated in a grazing season, but only during the growing season. Any grazing outside of the growing season is not incorporated into this. So basically, it takes 7 to 10 days, in which we have found that very similar up here in Canada, after defoliation of native species to grow tall enough to be grazed again. And then what we have found is that 3 or more successive defoliations, so this is 3 or more in a row defoliations, reduce the energy bank in your plants, which results in reducing vigor, reducing growth capacity, and stress tolerance. So, as I said, it's the number of times a plant is defoliated during a grazing period. So your estimated frequency is your grazing days, and those grazing days, again, are only in your growing season. So if your growing season is May to September, any grazing periods outside of that do not go into this calculation. And then you divide by 7 or 10. 7 is if the plants are growing quickly, more moisture, warm temperature. 10 is if the plants are growing more slow or slowly. You know, drier temperatures, drier climate, cooler temperatures. And again, only during the growing season. And that is scored on a scale of 1 to -1. So 1 defoliation within your grazing period scores a value of 1. 2 is 0 or neutral. So there's really no impacts on the plants. 3 is a negative one, meaning that you're starting to have a negative impact on your plant's growth. Then we look at intensity. Intensity is how much leaf material has been removed. And really, I guess you can think about it as how much photosynthetic material is left after the grazing to replenish your carbohydrates and recharge root systems. So basically, that's your solar capture. How much is left to be able to capture the solar energy? And crazy enough, our 50% take half, leave half that we've always sort of been toting up here for native species, take half, leave half, is that adequate leaf area. And just in the right-hand corner of the screen, there is that sort of the old fescue plants showing different intensities of grazing and how different intensities affect the root growth, the above-ground biomass and the below-ground biomass. And the more you take off, the less roots and the less above-ground biomass you're going to have. And this is assessed at the end of a grazing period. And unlike frequency, this is assessed at any time of the year. So if you are doing season-round grazing and you are grazing in the winter months, you still measure intensity. And I know there's been some debate out there. Some say, well, it's just during the growth period, and some say it's during the entire grazing period, any time of the year. I've sort of been back and forth with Roy Roth out of Colorado, and he is the creator of this tool, or one of the ones, and he indicates that it is any time of the year. And that sort of relates back to if you take off the above-ground biomass or a substantial amount of above-ground biomass in the winter, you still have effects of dehydration and cold and frost and stuff like that. You're sort of cooling the soil temperatures, and the wind blowing across dehydrates the plants. So again, any time of the year. And this scale is graded again on a 1, 0, and -1. Light, less than 40% utilization, so leaving about 60% of the plants behind, you score a 1. Moderate, 41 to 55, neutral. That's saying you're not positively but not negatively. It's just a neutral impact on the plants. And anything over 56%, you score a -1. And to really get a good understanding of this scoring, grazing cages are recommended for each year. And move those grazing cages throughout your fields, because keeping it in the same spot does not give a really good representation of what the growth potential was that year and how much you have taken off. Opportunity. Opportunity, and this is the one that I find the hardest to assess and the one that is the most objective. So again, this is probably where it's harder to assess. So, but basically opportunity is how much time plants have for growth before grazing or regrowth after grazing. This falls into that 4 principles of range management, and to allow for adequate rest for the plants to recover their root reserves and get that photosynthetic material, enough photosynthetic material out that you start recharging those root reserves. You allow for seed production or vegetative reproduction, that sort of thing. So the opportunity for rest. And it really equals most strongly to the long-term health and vigor of the plants. So that full growth or recovery allows, as I said, for nutrient storage and growth requirements for, reproduction, whether it's vegetative, whether it's seed set. And this one will mitigate the impacts of frequency and intensity. And there was a quote that a producer gave to me. He says, you can fix almost anything with rest. So if you do something this year that will have a negative impact, if you allow it the adequate rest, you're going to start, you're going to mitigate those impacts. And on this scale, it is weighted most heavily. It's one of the most important components of the GRI. This is assessed at the growing season, And again, it's the level of recovery after grazing. So if you graze it earlier in the spring, how much opportunity did it have for recovery after grazing, or opportunity for growth before grazing? So if you graze it midsummer, did it have an opportunity to have those root reserves and photosynthetic material out? And it's very subjective. There's nothing that you can really measure. You know, you can look at your grazing cages potentially, but it's dependent upon many factors: soil moisture, air temperature, how much leaf area was there before. And it is, as I think, the hardest factor to assess. And for somebody that's coming in from the outside to say an unknown area, you really have to understand the climatic variables, the grazing variables, the distribution factors on the pastures. All those sorts of things are really going to come into here, so you really need to know some background information. And this is scored on a value of 2 to -2, so 2 being full season. And you know, even within the assessment values, they're rather vague. It doesn't come down to like the 50% or the, you know, 3 times grazing, full season. Well, what does that mean? You know, exactly. So you're really going to have to do your best judgment of that. Most of the season you score 1, some chances 0, little chances -1, and no chances -2. So that's how you score your opportunity. So adding it up, the GRI rating is basically those scores that you would give for intensity, frequency, and opportunity, and adding them up. And the GRI rating, again, is the expected plant response to the current grazing management. So it says, what are my plants doing? The plants that I have there, what are they doing to with my current grazing management? So positive score equals benefit to the plant health, structure, and vigor. Excellent. Negative, detrimental to plant health. And if it's continued over the long term, and this is what is very important, remember the GRI is just a short-term monitoring tool, and because you get a negative score 1 year does not mean that over the long term you are going to be detrimental to your plant health and vigor. It just gives you a heads up that maybe you have to change your management. And 0 is neutral. Excuse me, sorry. So I've tried to put a little bit of an example together, and actually I shouldn't say I put a little bit of an example together. This was done in conjunction with May Elsinger and Cam Cater and Earl Svensson with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and it is actually within our Grazing Response Index fact sheet that will help you sort of walk through how to score a GRI. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the blue square on the left-hand side of your screen that has a red circle around it, and it's the long season ranch. And so just a little bit of background. Animals are placed in the field in spring, removed from field in the fall, so 150 days grazing period. So how do we score that on the GRI? So you go down to the table on the right-hand side where it says long season ranch in blue, and the results are circled in red. So May 24th to October 20th. Grazing days are 150 days. Frequency is -1, pardon me. If you divide 150 by 7 or by 10, you know, there are some days that will fall out of that period, but you're looking at around that, say, 10 defoliations of the grass species, which is more than the you know, 2 or 1 that is recommended. It's 3 or more. Intensity, in this example, intensity was sort of scored around that 50%, so that gives you a 0. So if you wanted to sort of look up on the top, we've got the frequency index, the intensity index, and the opportunity index. All those scores are there so you can kind of follow. So intensity falls within that moderate, or 41 to 55, which is 0. But opportunity, they're great. They're put in there in the spring, and they're taken out in the fall. There is no chance for the plants to have an opportunity to go through their growth requirements and to recharge those root reserves. Now we take an example from the Circle Ranch, which has incorporated a grazing rotation, and we're going to look at the west fields, and that area is circled in blue, and that grazing period is midsummer for 25 days. So the Circle West field is grazed from July 18th to August 11th. Those grazing period falls within the growing period. All those days fall within the growing period, and they are with it for 25 days. So the frequency, 25 divided by 7 potentially, or 10 at 2.5 to 3 times. So again, that's 3 or more when we look at the frequency index. So that scores -1. The intensity was judged as light, which is less than 40%, so we score a 1. The opportunity is 2. It's had a full season. In a lot of cases, if you're in southwest Saskatchewan, by July 18th to the end of August, a lot of your C4 grasses, or to the beginning of August, a lot of your C4 grasses have set seed and have gone through their growth requirements. So we scored that as 2. And then the overall score for that is 2. So you add -1 plus 1 and plus 2, your score is 2. But if you also look at the Circle Ranch right above the northwest field, even though it is in a rotational grazing system, what we found is that it did score a -1. Now the -1, and this is just above, I'm looking at the table, in the table on the bottom right-hand corner, and it says Circle Ranch Northwest Field. Even though it is in a grazing rotation, we still scored a -1. Scoring a -1 for 1 year, in a lot of cases, is what's going to happen. But it's what you do with that field the next year where the GRI really comes into use. So you look at that -1 and say, well, how do I get that to a positive for the next year to try and mitigate those impacts that I had the previous year? So you can see how this tool will work and help you with your management. So I'm going to touch a little bit on research and demonstration. There's 3 projects that I am aware of. There's probably more going on. I know that Don Thompson out of Lethbridge has dabbled, and Darren Brugel in Edmonton are starting to dabble or have dabbled in the GRI, but these are the ones that I'm most familiar with. So evaluating the Grazing Response Index for use in Western Canada, and that was done through Wendy Gardner in Dr. Wendy Gardner in Thompson Rivers University, with some help from May Elsinger and Brandon and myself in Saskatchewan. And I will get into more detail on that project later. That is the one that I am most familiar with. And then evaluating the GRI of 3 key forage species in southern Ontario, BC, and that was through Vanessa Volpati, and doing her master's thesis, again through the Thompson Rivers University, and Lavana Liggins, who used to work with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, who now works with the province in BC. She was a main supervisor on this project. And what Vanessa found is that blue bunch wheatgrass, I should back it up one step. They tested intensity and frequency on these plants. So they had more than 3 clippings, 1 clipping, and intensity 40% or 70% of these plants were taken, and then they monitored the response. And what they found with blue bunch wheatgrass is that was more affected by intensity, more so than frequency, the response, and rough fescue was affected by both. And then pinegrass, they really couldn't get a confirmed answer to how these plants will respond to, it was fairly variable how they would respond to frequency and intensity, but basically the main idea that Vanessa came up with, or the main answer, is that the GRI, the plants respond similar here in the interior of BC as they have in Colorado, where the GRI was developed and the science that it was based on. And then there is some work with tame forages in Saskatchewan, and that's through the Sask Forage Council, Ducks Unlimited, the Ministry of Agriculture, and AFC. Cam Cater, I don't know if he's on this talk or may else there, but they have been involved with AFC. And of course, tame forages create their own issue. Is, you know, do you take the 60% that's recommended? What are the ratings for frequency and intensity and recovery periods of tame forages are a little shorter than native forages? So how do you gauge those frequency, intensity, and opportunities? You may have to change your scale. So that's some work that's being ongoing in, at least in Saskatchewan, on tame forages. So back to evaluating the Grazing Response Index for use in Western Canada, and this is really looking at historical data. A lot of our community pasture data goes back to at least the 1980s, and this includes grazing history, so stocking rates and timing, time in, time out, the dates in and out. And then most sites have had, well, the sites that we looked at have 2 historical range condition assessments, and then we completed one in the field when we were actually assessing the GRI, and we looked at historical climate data. So what we really wanted to do was sort of backcast the GRI, and how does that relate to the climate that was through those periods, and how does that relate to stocking rates, timing of grazing, and range condition. So the hypotheses for this project was, if we scored, based on the information we have, a cumulative positive GRI score, we will see an increase in range condition. Or if through, you know, the last 20, 30 years, we have seen a negative cumulative GRI, we see a decrease in range condition, or 0 or neutral cumulative GRI, we will see no change in range condition. It's just kind of held constant. And other things that we did photo monitoring throughout the year in 2012, and then we GRI scored at the end of the season. The sites that we had in the study were Lac du Bois in interior BC, Auburn Wise Creek pasture, which is in Saskatchewan, which is just south of Swift Current, and a little south of Cadillac, Saskatchewan, if you know where that is, and Wallace pasture, which is just north of Vernon, Manitoba. And what Wendy found was, as you can see in this graph, that as the GRI improved, so did our range condition. There were a few outliers, but that trend was there for all pasture that we're assessing, that basic trend that historical data records and the historical GRI scores did correlate with an increase in range condition if the cumulative GRI was positive. Now, there were some issues with the model. The GRI is a field assessment, right? It's hard to try and, you know, we did our best estimate based on, you know, taking the closest weather station and historical climate data as we possibly could. We tried to do our best with distribution and field size. You know, all field sizes are not the same. The animal movements through the fields are not the same. So we tried to, you know, do our best within the model to accommodate some of those issues, but we couldn't accommodate them all. But overall, the model actually scored more conservatively than what we found when we scored it in the field. So if we potentially got a +2 GRI score, we would maybe get a 1 with the model. So it did score conservatively. So basically what Wendy came up with is that the GRI tool can be used in Western Canada based on the information that we have. But again, the cautionary statement is that it is a short-term monitoring tool, and it needs to be used in conjunction with longer-term plant monitoring. So some of the range health, range condition assessment methodologies that are out there to get a really good understanding of your impacts and your management impacts. So again, pros. It's based on science. It's simple. completed by producer and manager. It is effective. The data is readily available and allows producers and managers to make decisions in a timely manner. Simple. Again, as we went through a bit, as I said, some areas are subjective and you need to know the past history, and it really determines on what your end management goal is for. It was developed in for native rangelands in the United States, but some of the preliminary work has shown that it does respond similarly, or the science behind it is similar to what we find in Canada. And does it apply to tame forages? That question is still yet to be answered. And again, it does not measure long-term changes on the landscape, so plant species composition, structure, and physical aspects of such as soil erosion and litter. But it is one tool to put into your toolbox to help manage your landscape. And as a producer, you know, if they can't do the full plant species composition, you know, they could get that contracted out. But at the same time, this allows the producer and land manager to put a bit more control into their hands and really have an understanding of the potential impacts or the impacts that their grazing management has on their plants. So that is all I have. Thank you, and I guess I will turn it back to Kayla for questions.
All right, thank you very much, Kerry. All right, I don't have any questions in yet, so if anyone has a question they want to ask, there's a question box there. You can type it in. I'll wait a few seconds to see if anything comes in, but there will be a follow-up email tomorrow, and Kerry's email address will be in there. So if you think of anything, feel free to email her.
I have a question, Kayla.
Oh, yeah.
Out of all the participants within this webinar, could they send in just to say like how many are familiar with the GRI, or is this their first exposure to the GRI?
Okay, yeah. If anyone wants to, I guess, help allude to that, they can type that in the question box as well. I think I had one pop up here. I have one first exposure. I'm just trying to open the question box here. All right, first exposure. I have 4 first exposures, 5 first exposures. So someone participated in a GRI workshop in 2013.
Right.
Another first exposure, so that's 7. I have a question here. Can you distribute the Gardner et al. 2015 paper?
Yes, I could.
Okay, so maybe if they email you, and then you can email them back with it.
Right, and I can also distribute the master's thesis from Vanessa if anybody is interested in that just sort of shows the plant response.
Perfect. I'm getting quite a few more first exposures here, so that's really good that people are interested in learning about this. I have a question here. How do producers usually measure removal and residual? Are they clipping, drying, and weighing, or are they clipping, drying, and weighing, or are they just doing visual estimates inside and outside of cages?
The GRI was based for just visual estimations between the grazing cages and the out grazed area, but again, it all really depends on how in depth they want to go. If they want to do clippings and drying and really get that objective understanding of how much they're taking off, that is completely up to them. But through my personal experience, at least for the first components, if I was a producer or recommending this to a producer, I wouldn't say you had to dry and weigh every year, but once you train your eye, right, it's sort of like that litter raking on range health, where once you have, you know, the measured sample of litter and what you're raking and comparing and showing and estimating and really quantifying it through measurements, you've trained your eye to look. And you may at times underestimate in the past or overestimate. So if you can do those checks, more power to you. And I think that's a great component. But in most cases, it's grazing cages or exclusions and doing your best visual estimation of what is remaining and what was there.
Great. Okay. Have another question here. I'm not an expert on cows, but I assume they will eat forbs as well. Is the impact on forbs captured in this tool?
Well, and you know, it's interesting, I just had that question. Again, this is for native grasslands, and forbs, are a small component of usually create a small component of the overall forage that is available for grazing. But it really hasn't gone into an understanding on how forbs respond to grazing. Do they respond the same as grasses? So I guess in a short answer is this was developed on grass species and not on forb species. Being that forbs typically create a very small component, or palatable forbs create a small component of the mixture, it was focused more on grasses. I would think, especially once you start getting into tame grasses, or tame forages, how does alfalfa or sainfoin and those things, do they respond similarly? I would say in some cases no, because the other factor that comes into it is shrubs, and based on certain grassland shrubs can create a large component of the grazing system. So short answer is no, forbs really aren't included, but I think if your system is focused and mainly on grasses, you could use this assessment, because talking to Roy Roth, you focus on where most of your grazing comes from. So if most of your grazing, 80% of your grazing comes from grasses, that is what you want to manage for, because everything else will kind of take care of itself after that point. So really focus on, where most of your grazing comes from. And I hope there's more work on forbs to see how they respond, especially if you're starting, or shrubs, especially once you start getting into communities that are dominated by forbs or desirable forbs.
Okay, great. Getting a few questions in now, so that's great. Can you comment on how to use, and if it's possible to use, the GRI as sort of a proxy for good wildlife habitat?
Actually, yes, you can. Roy Roth has actually done a bunch of work with sage grouse habitat and requirements. So, as I kind of stated previously, the GRI, the opportunity, you can score that based on your outcomes and what you're managing for. So you really have to know what you're managing for. So if what you're managing for Sprague's pipit habitat and what you're managing for say sage grouse habitat may be completely different, and you will have to change your grazing strategies for that. So yes, the GRI can be used to try and help to create that habitat, because you need to know your influence, such as sage-grouse habitat. You need to know that you need to have more forbs. Well, to get more forbs in a native system habitat, typically you have to take a little bit more of the grasses away and allow for spaces for the forbs to come in. They're more increase their species rather than decrease their species, jumping back into the range condition methodology. But you have to understand, you know, how your impacts are going forward to achieving that goal. I don't think it's a replacement and that will be your one tool to be used, but an understanding of how your plants grow will help you to create, how your plants grow and how they respond to grazing will help you create that desirable habitat. Because if you want Sprague's pipit habitat, you're probably going to want to have more positive scores than you will have negative scores, because you want that litter and that really good cover. But if you're going to manage for sage-grouse habitat, or at least one of the foraging areas, I know sage-grouse habitat has a variety of habitats, you might want to manage a little lower on the scale so you get some of those increaser species coming into the mix. Does that help? I hope.
Yeah, that's a good question and good answer. What is the typical dimension of a grazing cage?
Ours are about 1 meter by 1 meter. I think that you can get a really good representative sample. I wouldn't go smaller than that because, in all honesty, cows push the sides in, and then they'll actually graze some of it out if they push it in far enough. But about 1 meter by 1 meter or bigger is kind of what we've been using. Sometimes you put up complete exclosures, but again, those are hard to move. If anybody wants the dimensions of the grazing cages we use, I can send our specs out for that person that would want, you know, it'll show you the length of the size, the height of them, what materials, that kind of stuff. If anybody wants that, I've got that.
Great, okay. Can you compare the GRI with the range health assessment tool that is currently being used on Alberta public lands? Do you have any familiarity with that?
Can I compare?
Yeah.
No. Can I? Okay, so what we'll do is we will back up to the work that Wendy Gardner did. I don't know if you can hand me your screen again. Can you pass the screen to me?
Sure.
So the GRI is only to determine your impacts on your plants, where the range health looks at species composition, it looks at bare soil, it looks at how much litter, oh sorry, there goes my clock, how much bare soil, invasive species there is. Now, I'll back up one step here, or a few steps, whoops. What we have found, and the range health and the range condition may have a similar aspect, but what we have found over the long term, the GRI scores, which is these squares at the bottom, have improved at Auburn Wise Creek over the long term, and over the long term, the range condition has also improved. So from this information, what you can find is that if you score positively on the GRI score over time, over the long term, you are going to see that positive increase in range condition or range health, because you're maintaining the vigor of your plants, and you're allowing those plants to have that regrowth capacity. You're leaving vegetation behind to create that litter and cover the soil, which in range health. Do they work together? Absolutely, but one cannot take the place of the other. They need to be worked in conjunction with each other, and that is what all the research that I have been familiar with and my experience on the landscape is that GRI gives you that snapshot in time to be able to say, what do I have to change for the next year to maintain plant health? Range health is more of a long-term monitoring. You may not see changes in your plant species composition immediately. That's a slower process. You may not see changes in your litter. That's a slower process. But working in conjunction with the GRI, which gives you that indication of, okay, what are my impacts on the plants, positive or negative? If they're positive over the long term, I should be able to either maintain a range health condition or improve it. If it's negative, over the long term, my range condition is probably going to, or range health is going to decrease. So they're separate, but they work really well together, because to do a range health assessment every year is a very laborious and intensive job. But it's needed for management. But you can do the GRI every year and then sort of start incorporating into that, whatever it is, a 5-year term or 3-year term, however you decide, you can start putting that range health assessment in. Does that hopefully answer their question?
Yeah, it was a good explanation. Thank you. If you can just give me back control, there were a couple more questions that I can't see.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. No, I just can't get to them unless I'm presenter. Wonderful. Thank you. Right. No, it looks like I lost my questions there with the switch over. There were 2 more questions. There was one from Michael Bradstreet, and there was an additional one. So if you just want to type them again, then I can ask them right away here. Sorry, I didn't realize it would do that. I've never done that during questions. That's okay. Hopefully they can type it in again quickly here. All right, maybe in the meantime, I'll give them a few minutes here to type in their questions again. And I'm just going to go to our homepage here. There was a question about where this presentation will be posted after. So this is our homepage, pcap-sk.org. And if you go under Communications and Native Prairie Speaker Series, right here, the link to the YouTube page will be right here. And if you go to the bottom of our website, you'll see the links to our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube page, so you can follow us and keep up to date with us there. And this is our conference website here. We are hosting the 11th Prairie Conservation and Endangered Species Conference coming up in Saskatoon, February 16th to 18th. So we have a drafts program available, and you can register right on the PCAP website. It'll take you back to our registration page there. So if you're interested or have any questions about that, register or let me know if you have any questions. All right, there's no other questions being asked, so sorry about that to those couple people. If you think of them again or want to get into touch with Kerry, her email will be provided in the follow-up email tomorrow. And when you close this window, a survey will pop up. Oh, I did get a question here, so good. There'll be a pop-up window for a couple survey questions, and if you could just take the few seconds to answer those survey questions, that does really help us with our funding. So, okay, question here. Given the good correlation between GRI and range health, what would you recommend between annual GRI and more comprehensive range health assessments every 3, 5, or 10 years? Do you want me to read that again?
Nope. I'm just trying to think of the best answer. And maybe, 3 years I think is fairly short. How should I put this? I would start as soon as the grazing program, or within your pasture system, if you haven't, I would start with your fundamental range health assessment. And then understanding with your GRI with the positive impacts, I would say every 5 to 10, well, 10 might be pushing it, but over 5 years. Because also within the GRI, you know, there's those positive impacts that you're seeing with your plants if you're doing it correctly. But I might just kind of squeeze in there a little bit on litter. Like, you can look at litter fairly quickly, and that's a really good indication of, you know, improvements. So I would say 5 years is fairly good. On our community pastures, we actually did it every 10 years. Sometimes I think that's labor and the huge, you know, 2.5 million acres we were working with. It was quite a huge area to be able to get back to it. Did sort of that 5-year cycle, that would be okay. And, you know, I'm going to give you another political answer, I think, because I guess a politician never wants to kind of confirm one answer. If you, depending on what your range health score comes in at, you know, I would do a mini range health score. If it's low, the GRI scoring positive. So if you're coming into a situation where you have a lot of issues, I would do mini health assessments. I wouldn't do the full-blown species composition because, you know, necessarily, but look at that bare ground and look at those litter components. You know, you could do that on a yearly or every 2 to 3 years. So it's sort of a mini range health assessment. Don't get into the species composition. 5 to 10 years is probably lots with the species composition, but sort of those mini range health where it incorporates the litter, especially if you're starting off, you know, with some of the pictures that I showed where the grass is very short, there's very little litter and things like that. So you can also quantify in your own mind that, yeah, we're seeing improvements, and maybe you will see the improvements by the increases in the structure of the vegetation, but those litter components in bare soil is one thing that you can do a mini range health assessment on in between, and then 5 to 10 years depending on your range health at the beginning. If it comes in poor, I would do them more frequent just so you can confirm, you know, you're going to have to make those changes. And then if you're coming in really good range or in good range health, I would do them, you know, a little more spread out. But again, monitoring those bare soil and litter kind of mini range health in between.
Okay, great. Is there a formal booklet relating to the GRI approach?
No, there is no formal GRI booklet that came from the United States. A lot of it is just fact sheets, but maybe, Kayla, through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, we did create a fact sheet slash examples that we kind of went through, and then actually a worksheet that you can take out and score in the field. So maybe on your website, could we create a link to this document, because it will give the background, not into all the science. Unfortunately, a lot of the science is with Roy Roth in the States, but this provides a background, a bit of a description of how to figure things out, a worksheet, and examples. So maybe we can create that link.
Yep.
Off your website.
Yep, that's a fantastic idea. Yeah, we can do that for sure. A couple more questions here. Someone that missed the first few slides but is wondering if this tool would show if grassland composition has changed. For example, if dominant species has changed due to grazing and others are higher in amounts because they resist grazing pressure.
Oh, I'm sorry, you'll have to repeat that.
Okay. I'm wondering if this tool would show if grassland composition has changed. For example, if dominant species has changed due to grazing and others are in higher amounts because they resist grazing pressure.
Oh, amounts. Okay, sorry, I heard mountains. So I was like, please clarify. This GRI tool does not monitor species composition. This tool only will determine your potential impacts on your plants. So does it have a positive influence on the plant health and vigor. Doesn't matter what plants are there, but is it having a positive influence on the plant health and vigor? But again, I will relate back to the correlation between range condition, which is strictly a species composition score, and the GRI score, the historical GRI score. There is that correlation that the more positives or neutrals you have, you will see an improvement in range condition or range health, which is your species composition. It will not give you your species composition, but it does correlate very well with having a more desirable species composition.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Does that help, I hope?
Yeah, that makes sense. One last comment here to wrap things up. Larger pastures may have benefits for wildlife, such as fewer fences and fewer predator perches. It seems to me that it would be easier to achieve higher GRI scores with smaller pastures. Any comments on that?
Yes and no. Like, our community pasture system is very extensive, very extensive. You know, having a 9-section field is fairly common. When, you know, on those extensive systems, you have a lot of potential issues with distribution depending on water and mineral and stock density and all these sorts of things. You use the GRI on the sites that are getting the most grazing. Okay, so and this is where the simplicity of the tool may get lost. When you look at, say, a large system, you want to manage, or an extensive system, you want to manage where most of your grazing is coming from. If you're in a 9-section field and only 2 sections are getting the grazing, you actually want to change your management to manage for those 2 sections. The rest doesn't matter because they are out of this, they're not being grazed, they're not being touched. So you don't even really have to worry about those, and this is sort of the debate and the conversations that I've had with Roy. So you want to manage for the areas that are getting that grazing. So you know, so what you would do, and this is how I would go about it, go out into those extensive systems, find the patches, and then try and how to mitigate for management on those patches. You improve distribution, you have already reduced the frequency. This is where again, the simplicity of the tool starts to get lost. When you go to those sites that historically are getting 90% of the grazing and you change that grazing, you may still be in the same field, but you change that grazing and move it out from those two sections out onto the other remaining 7 sections, you've already decreased your frequency on that. Then, you know, how do I work with opportunity? Is it in a grazing rotation? I don't know. And then intensity. Once you start working with distribution issues on extensive systems, and that's really what you start getting into is distribution issues, once you start changing those distribution patterns, you then reduce the intensity and the frequency on those fields. So that is where the manager needs to know what is really happening on the landscape, because you can score really good scores on extensive systems if you understand where the dominant grazing is happening, you work with your distribution issues and try and mitigate that as much as possible. It will never be perfect, but there are ways that you can score neutral or positive. Yes, if you've got really controlled grazing, yeah, you know, moving them every hour, of course, right? The plants are going to get more rest, they're going to have more opportunity, that sort of stuff. Yeah, it will become easier to get better scores. So yes, you're right. but there's a lot of ways to mitigate those impacts on extensive systems where you can score positive or neutral depending on all the management that comes into it. Oilers, waterers, you know, stock density, herding. There's a gentleman in the States that's really doing some, and I'm sort of taking a little tangent, that's really doing a lot of work with just herding the animals, training his animals to herd properly, and working on extensive systems without fences. So it's the type of management that goes into your extensive system. So that would be my long answer. So there are ways on extensive systems to get really good scores, but yes, of course, intensive systems with the movement of animals improves. But just keep in mind, on intensive systems, unless you balance your intensity and your opportunity, you can score just as horrible. Poor management on intensive systems can get as bad a score. Like if you're taking, you know, more than 50% when you go in, your stock densities are too high when you go into a smaller pasture. Or you think, well, I got a little bit of regrowth, so I'm going to go hit it again. Well, I'm going to go hit it again. Well, you may not have given it any opportunity. So poor management on either side can score low. So really, it's all about management and what you do.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, that's it for questions. So I will end it soon here. Thank you very much, Kerry, for joining us and giving that webinar. There were lots of great questions, and I think people learned a lot. I know I did. So again, I'll include Kerry's email in the follow-up email tomorrow. If you have any further questions or anything for her, if you'd like to get your hands on the paper or thesis work there, feel free to email her and get that from her. We'll also post a link on our website to those GRI references that Kerry also mentioned, so keep your eyes open for that. I'd just like to quickly mention again, thank you to the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for providing in-kind support, and that this project was undertaken with the financial support of the Government of Canada and the Federal Department of the Environment. So thank you again, Kerry. Our next webinar will be on January 18th, so keep your eyes open for the registration for that. Thank you very much for everyone for joining. I really appreciate it. Hope you learned something, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks, Kerry.
Thank you.